A millionaire in a wheelchair goes to a cafe and is served by a poor 8-year-old girl. What she says makes him cry. Before we dive into the story, I'm Marcos Paulo, the storyteller. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The rain pounded hard against the windows of Mama Rosa's cafe, as if the sky itself were crying along with Richard Wellington's heavy heart. He rolled inside, pushing his sleek titanium wheelchair, dropped sliding off his expensive suit onto the worn linoleum floor. At 45, Richard was already used to strange looks, conversations dying when he entered, people awkwardly trying not to stare. But that little cafe on the outskirts of Cleveland felt different, carrying a scent of home he hadn't felt in a long time. It was an old place with yellow wallpaper peeling and red booths that held stories from hundreds of customers before him. As he moved down the narrow aisle, he noticed the delicious smell of coffee mixed with something sweet, maybe fresh pie. It was the kind of place his late wife Emma would have loved, back when love still existed in his life. "Welcome to Mama Rosa's," chirped a tiny voice that sounded straight out of a fairy tale. Richard turned his head and felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't an adult woman greeting him, but a little girl around 8 years old, standing on a crate to reach the counter. She had dark hair tied in a ponytail and wore an apron so big it nearly reached her feet. The sleeves rolled up into a bow that looked like a giant knot. "A table for one, sir?" she asked, with such serious politeness it was almost funny. Richard stood there for a moment, just staring, then replied, Yes, just me." The girl hopped off the crate with a quick bounce, grabbed a menu, and led him through the cafe. Her little feet made soft, tapping sounds on the floor. When they reached a corner by the window, she carefully placed the menu on the table. Richard noticed how tiny her hands were, smaller even than those of the granddaughters he never got to see grow up because of the accident that had destroyed everything. She introduced herself with a gentle smile, her name tag swinging, "Sarah." Then she asked, "Can I bring you some coffee, sir? Mama Rosa makes the best in the neighborhood. She taught me how to brew it just right, not too strong, not too weak, perfect to warm your heart on a day like today." There was something in that voice, a warmth Richard hadn't heard since Emma died. He swallowed hard. "Coffee would be great," he managed to say. Sarah walked to the counter and grabbed a chipped mug, filling it carefully, her tongue poking out slightly as she concentrated on not spilling a drop. When she returned, she set the cup in front of him. "All ready, sir. Now tell me, what brought you to our little cafe today? You don't seem like you're from around here." Richard looked down at his Swiss watch, his tailored suit, the wheelchair that cost more than anyone's house in that cafe. "I just needed to get away from some things." Sarah nodded, as solemn as someone much older. "Sometimes getting away helps us find what we're looking for, even if we don't know what that is." It hit Richard like a punch. How could an 8-year-old understand what therapists, psychologists, and counselors hadn't managed in 3 years? "How old are you again?" he asked, voice cracking. 8 3/4, but Mama Rosa says I have an old soul." She studied him with big eyes and said, "You look very sad, sir. The kind of sadness from carrying something heavy for a long time." Richard felt his chest tighten. "Yeah, I suppose I do." Then Sarah leaned in and placed her tiny hand on his arm, so light and pure that Richard nearly fell apart right there. "You know what my grandma always said? That sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be, right at the perfect time. Maybe you needed to walk in here today. Maybe you needed to meet me." Those simple words from that little girl broke through the wall Richard had been building for years. He tried to hide it by wiping the corner of his eyes with a napkin, but the tears didn't obey. They started falling, one after the other. Sarah didn't look even slightly scared. She just gave a little smile and said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world, "It's okay to cry. Tears are just love with nowhere to go, and I think you have a lot of love stored up in there." Richard let his coffee grow cold as he pulled himself together. When he looked up again, Sarah was serving another customer, but before walking away, she shot him a quick look and said, "Come back tomorrow, okay? I make pancakes almost as good as Mama Rosa's." He laughed, a small laugh, but the first in a long time. That night, he could hardly sleep. He kept hearing her words. Sometimes getting away helps us find what we're looking for. The next day, at exactly 9, he was there again at Mama Rosa's door. Sarah nearly jumped when she saw him. "I knew you'd come back. I saved your spot." The place seemed prettier than the day before. Richard noticed simple flowers in glass jars on the tables and children's drawings taped to the walls. The smell of fresh coffee and bacon sizzling made his stomach growl for the first time in months. "Mama Rosa's making blueberry pancakes today," Sarah said as she set down the coffee. "She uses real blueberries and a secret ingredient that makes it taste like you're eating a piece of heaven." Richard laughed. "You seem to know everything that happens here." Sarah turned serious. "When you really listen to people, they tell you everything you need to know. Yesterday, I could tell you hadn't eaten a real meal in a long time. You've got that look. Someone feeding the body but forgetting to feed the soul." Richard found himself stunned by how direct this child was. "How do you know so much about people?" Sarah pulled a worn little notebook from her apron pocket. "I collect people, like how some people collect stickers." She opened it to pages filled with notes. "Mrs. Henderson likes her coffee with exactly 2 sugars and 1 cream. Mr. Peterson always orders pie first because he says life's too short to save dessert for last." He asked softly, "And what did you write about me?" Sarah blushed, turned the book and read that you have eyes that have seen too much sadness, but they're still kind, and that even though you were sad, you still said please and thank you. Mama Rosa says that shows someone's character. That afternoon, Richard went back to the huge, silent apartment where he lived alone. He sat by the window, watching the rain fall over Cleveland, while feeling something new inside, a kind of good restlessness, almost hope. He didn't understand why, but Sarah's words kept echoing in his mind. Sometimes God puts us exactly where we need to be. For the first time in 3 years, he wanted to know more about someone who wasn't himself or his business. The next day, almost without thinking, he decided to look it up on his computer. He searched for the cafe's name on Google, curious about the place. He discovered that Mama Rosa's was drowning in debt. The property had unpaid taxes nearly up for auction. Suppliers had been waiting months for payment, and there was even a notice of sanitation problems that would require expensive repairs to fix. Richard took a deep breath. That simple place, so full of life, was on the edge of disappearing. He decided to go deeper. He asked Margaret, his assistant of decades, to pull everything. Margaret brought back a stack of papers. "You're not going to like what's here, Mr. Wellington." The numbers showed Mama Rosa owed almost everyone and could only keep the doors open because the entire neighborhood found ways to help, buying a coffee or two, turning a blind eye to the debts. Richard sat silently looking at the reports, feeling a strange weight, almost fear of losing something he hadn't even realized he wanted so badly to hold on to. The next day, he returned to the cafe. Sarah was waiting at the door, happy, as if they'd been childhood friends. "Sit down, Mr. Richard. Today we've got banana muffins." He smiled, let her guide him to his favorite table, and started observing everything more carefully. He saw Mama Rosa quietly singing in the kitchen as she stirred a giant bowl of batter. He saw Sarah jotting down orders in a colorful notepad, treating each customer like an old friend. He watched an elderly couple walk in, holding hands, and leave smiling, carrying pies wrapped in simple paper. When Sarah brought the coffee, Richard asked, "You like being here, don't you?" She nodded vigorously. "It's my favorite place in the world. Here I'm not just a poor little girl. I'm important. Mama Rosa needs me, and I like helping." Richard felt something tighten in his chest. He remembered what it was like to feel needed before life turned into that barren wasteland after Emma and the kids died. "And your mother?" he ventured. Sarah shrugged. "Mom works a lot, 3 jobs. She's almost never home, so I come here before school. Mama Rosa lets me help, and she even gives me breakfast." Richard stayed silent. As Sarah went back to the counter, he just stared at the cup in front of him. It wasn't just coffee, it was a bridge. a reminder of how life could be full of small gestures that saved entire days. He started to think of everything he could do for that place, not out of pity, but because, strangely, he needed that small world to keep existing. Maybe even more than Mama Rosa and Sarah did. The next day, Richard discreetly had a trusted lawyer buy the cafe building and pay off all its debts. He didn't want anyone to know he was behind it. The idea wasn't to do charity to soothe his ego, but to save something that suddenly felt too important to let vanish. He had everything done through shell companies, so not even Mama Rosa would suspect. Only later would he decide what to do with it. Meanwhile, Sarah continued to charm him with her blunt way of being. That week, he saw her scold a rude customer who had spoken harshly to Mama Rosa. "You know, sir, Mama Rosa lost her husband last year, and she gets sad sometimes. You shouldn't talk to her like that." The man looked embarrassed, apologized, and left. Richard was impressed. She was just a little girl, but seemed to have such a huge strength inside her that he couldn't explain. One afternoon, Sarah sat down at his table. "Can I ask a kinda silly question?" He nodded. "Why are you always so sad? Is it because you can't walk?" Richard took a deep breath, choosing his words. "No, dear. It's not the chair. It's because I lost my family, and sometimes I feel so alone. It's like the whole world is pressing down on me." Sarah looked at him with those big ancient eyes. "I feel like that too when Mom doesn't come home. But Mama Rosa told me that sometimes God sends special people so we don't feel so alone. I think maybe you were sent for me, and maybe I was sent for you too." Richard couldn't hold it back. The tears came again, but this time he didn't try to hide them. Sarah simply held his hand across the table as if it was the most natural thing in the world. When Mama Rosa arrived with warm pancakes, she found the two of them like that, connected by a silence full of meaning. She smiled and said, "I think you two were the answer to each other's prayers." That night, Richard lay awake thinking about it. He'd never really believed in destiny, but he couldn't deny that this girl had changed something inside him. He decided then that he would do even more. He would officially create the Emma Wellington Foundation, using part of the fortune that had just been sitting in investments. The first project? Transform Mama Rosa's into a community center where kids could learn, eat, and feel like they belonged somewhere. By the next week, Richard had everything ready with his lawyers. Mama Rosa's building was saved, debts paid, and a discreet renovation began to fix the health code issues. Mama Rosa was puzzled, but the real estate attorney simply told her the new owner wanted to improve the property. She thanked them, emotional, not knowing who was really behind it. Meanwhile, Sarah kept coming every morning, helping however she could before school, serving coffee and clearing cups with a pride that lit up the whole place. But not everything was rosy. One day, Richard arrived and found the little cafe unusually quiet. Sarah was sitting on a bench, eyes watery, while Mama Rosa spoke on the phone with a worried expression. When she hung up, Rosa whispered, "It's child services. Someone reported me, saying I'm exploiting child labor because Sarah helps here." Richard felt his blood boil. Who would do that? 1,000 worries ran through his mind. This could ruin everything. Sarah stood up and came over. "I'm not working. I just help because I like it. I don't want them to take Mama Rosa to jail or take me away from here." Richard gently cupped her little face. "No one's taking you away, I promise." But inside, he was alarmed. He knew well how social processes could be cruel, even when people's only intention was to care for each other. He immediately texted Margaret and his lawyer David, demanding they prepare everything to protect that child and that cafe. The next morning, a social worker arrived. She wore a gray suit and had the hardened look of someone who had seen too many ugly cases. She asked firmly, "Does Sarah work here? Does she receive any payment?" Mama Rosa stammered, trying to explain that no, the girl only got breakfast and stayed because she didn't want to be alone at home. But the woman kept noting everything on her tablet, her brow furrowing deeper. That's when Sarah, with a courage that made Richard emotional, said, "I don't work here. I help because Mama Rosa lost her husband and gets sad." And because my mum works too much and can't give me breakfast before school. So I come here, I eat, and I help. There's nothing wrong with that. The social worker took a deep breath. Sweetie, you understand children can't work, right? But I don't work. I'm part of this. This is family. The woman looked at Richard, as if expecting a sensible argument from an adult. And that's when he, with all his business world coolness, but a completely surrendered heart, said, "Actually, this is an educational project. I'm the founder of the Emma Wellington Foundation, and we're starting a pilot program here. The children learn about responsibility, hygiene, customer service. It's all supervised, completely legal." The social worker raised an eyebrow. "I'm not aware of this program." Richard pulled out papers Margaret had prepared that very dawn. Official documents, the foundation's registration, educational plans, everything in order. The woman spent a few minutes reading. She seemed less hostile, but still serious. "I'll need to do a full inspection. If everything is as you say, there'll be no problem." Before leaving, she looked at Sarah with a certain respect. "You're very brave, young lady." Sarah just gave a little smile, not letting go of Richard's hand. After the worker left, Mama Rosa sat down, exhausted. "Mr. Wellington, Richard, I don't know what to say. All this you did, the foundation, the papers, you're saving not just my cafe, but Sarah and her mother." Richard took a deep breath. "It's you who are saving me, Rosa. You and this little girl reminded me what it's like to have a purpose." Sarah nestled into his arm and whispered, "I told you God sends the right people at the right time." In the days that followed, the little cafe really did turn into a learning center. Richard hired teachers to give tutoring before school, brought in nutritionists to talk about healthy foods, and let Sarah be the little ambassador of the project. She proudly showed how to measure flour for pancakes, how to properly wash a cup, and how to treat a customer with kindness. Neighborhood children started coming, brought by mothers who'd heard about the foundation. They were boys and girls whose faces looked far too tired for their young age. But soon, the place was full of laughter, small arguments over who would wash dishes, and proud, "Look what I made," each time a batch of cookies came out of the oven. Richard spent mornings there, often just watching, as if feeding his soul with every small moment. But it didn't take long for someone to try to ruin it. An investigative reporter began sniffing around, saying he'd received tips that a traumatized millionaire was exploiting poor children to soothe his guilt. Richard was furious. David advised him to stay calm, but the anger was almost unbearable. What hurt most was thinking Sarah could be dragged into scandals and unfair judgments. One afternoon, the reporter called Jennifer, Sarah's mother, directly, asking loaded questions. She got so scared she called Richard, crying. "I don't want them to take Sarah from me, please, Mr. Wellington," he answered firmly. "Jennifer, no one's taking your daughter, trust me. Tomorrow we'll fix this." The next morning, Richard gathered Jennifer, Mama Rosa, and Sarah at the cafe. He explained what the journalist wanted to do and said there was only one way out. They would tell the story themselves. "We'll call the TV, tell the truth before they invent something horrible, but only if you all want to. It'll be public, there could be nasty people commenting, but it might also save all this." Jennifer looked at Sarah, who thought for a moment, then said, "Mom, remember what you say about bullies at school? That we don't let them run our lives just because they shout louder. So I think we have to show what's real." Richard felt a wave of pride and fear at the same time. That little girl was the bravest human being he had ever met. Mama Rosa wiped her eyes and said, "Then let's do it. We won't let anyone tell us who we are without hearing our voice first." On the day scheduled for the live report, the little cafe seemed to breathe nervousness. Mama Rosa kept tidying and retidying the counter non-stop. Jennifer adjusted her blouse for the 10th time, and Sarah bit her lip, a bit scared. Richard came closer, rested his hand on her shoulder and said, "There's nothing to be afraid of. We're just going to show who we are. The truth speaks for itself." Sarah took a deep breath and held tightly onto his hand. "Okay, but you won't let go of my hand during the interview, promise?" Richard smiled. Promise. The reporter arrived, accompanied by cameras and microphones. She started by praising the wonderful smell of coffee and pies, but soon became serious. Mr. Wellington, why would a millionaire invest so much money in a neighborhood cafe and a children's program instead of something more traditional? Richard looked at Sarah, took a deep breath, and spoke with a voice heavy with emotion. Because this place reminded me what it's like to love and be loved. And these children taught me that money is only worth something if it's used to create a future. Sarah was called up to speak and surprised everyone. With her sweet yet firm voice, she explained, Mr. Richard doesn't buy people, he gives chances. Now my mom is going to study to become a nurse and will have more time for me. And I come here because I want to, not because someone tells me to. Here I'm important. I'm not just another poor kid. The reporter blinked, almost moved. The cameraman even did a discreet zoom on her bright eyes. When the broadcast ended, Richard let out a breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. Mama Rosa hugged him tightly, crying. Jennifer did the same. Sarah jumped into his arms and whispered, I think we won, didn't we? He hugged the little girl against his chest. I think so, little one. But even if we hadn't, what matters is that we showed who we are, and you did that better than any adult. But hours later, his phone rang. It was an unknown number. When he answered, he heard a voice that made his spine go cold. Wellington, this is Frank Morrison. Remember me? The guy you tried to destroy after I killed your family in that accident. Richard felt his body nearly give out. Frank continued, dripping with venom. I saw your cute little story on TV today. What a fine saint you've become. But would the public like to know what you did to me? The investigations, the bribes, the veiled threats. How about an interview about that? Richard closed his eyes. The past came back with full force to haunt him. What do you want, Frank? He asked hoarsely. To meet you tomorrow at Riverside Park at noon, alone. Otherwise, I'll tell everything to the same reporter who praised you today. Before Richard could answer, Frank hung up. He stood there frozen, phone still pressed to his ear, feeling like the ground had vanished. That night, Richard didn't sleep a wink. He paced through the wide living room of his apartment, passing by expensive paintings and furniture that seemed to mock his loneliness. He thought of Emma, of how she would have solved all this with a hug, a hot coffee, and a few simple words. But she wasn't there anymore. And now he had to deal with Frank Morrison, the man who not only destroyed his family behind the wheel, but also became the victim of his vengeful rage. The next morning, Richard went to Mama Rosa's before the meeting. He needed to see Sarah, needed a bit of that light she carried in her eyes. The little girl ran up to him as soon as he entered. You look pale, like you're sick. He gave a weak smile. A little nervous, sweetheart. Sarah held his hand tightly, as if she could transfer courage through the skin. It's going to be okay. Mama Rosa says we just need to do what's right and leave the rest to God. He bent down as far as his chair would allow and kissed her forehead. Mama Rosa, who was watching from the counter, gave a nod, almost a silent blessing. Richard left the cafe with his heart a little less tight, though still heavy. Riverside Park was grey, the lake reflecting a sky thick with clouds. Frank waited for him on a bench, staring at the ground, hands trembling. You came alone. Good sign, Frank said when he saw him approach. Thought you'd come with a lawyer or security. Richard simply gestured. He had no energy for irony. He sat beside him, both silent for long minutes. The wind rustled the leaves and brought the damp smell of cut grass. They seemed like two old men, broken under the weight of mistakes too big for easy words. Finally, Frank spoke. I hated you, more than you hated me, because I knew what I did to your family, but when you started ruining the rest of my life, then I just became afraid. Afraid of you, afraid of myself. Richard swallowed hard. And me? I felt vindicated for a few minutes. Then there was just more pain. Frank turned his face, eyes red. I killed them. I know that. No matter how much I try to fool myself by saying it was an accident. And you killed who I could have become after. Now here we are, two cowards trying to find some redemption. Richard gripped the armrest of his chair tightly. "That's why I'm going to confess. Tomorrow. I don't want to live pretending anymore." Frank looked at him with bitter surprise. "Really? You're going to destroy yourself like that?" Richard sighed. "If it's going to end, let it end with the truth. But if anything remains, I want it to be clean." Frank stood up, ran a hand over his tired face. "Good luck, Wellington. I hope you find peace, because I'm still looking." That night, Richard almost didn't go back home. After the meeting with Frank, he wandered through the streets of downtown Cleveland, the building lights reflecting in his eyes like luminous ghosts. He thought 1,000 times about giving up, getting on a plane to some remote place and disappearing. But then he remembered Sarah's little face, saying that love is stronger than fear, and the way Jennifer and Rosa looked at him as if he were part of that small family. He couldn't betray them. When he got home, he spent hours writing a letter he might never send. "To Emma and our children," he wrote at the top. He told everything, from the deep love he felt for them to the hatred that consumed him afterward. He confessed to hunting down Frank with all the cruelty that money could buy. In the end, he wrote something that brought tears to his eyes. "Forgive me for having become so small before my pain." The next day, Richard called a press conference at the convention center. News spread quickly. Reporters, onlookers, and even rivals filled the hall. Mama Rosa arrived early with Sarah and Jennifer. Rosa's face was worried, but her eyes showed she trusted him. Sarah held Richard's hand like his anchor to reality. "It's going to be okay. Even if the world collapses, it's going to be okay because you're doing what's right," she said, not realizing the poetry in her words. When the clock struck 10 key, Richard stood behind the microphone, took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. "I'm here today, not as a businessman, not as a philanthropist, but as a broken man." A murmur ran through the hall. He continued, his voice firm despite the weight. 3 years ago, I lost my family in an accident caused by a drunk driver. Frank Morrison, who is here today, paid his debt to justice, but I wanted him to pay more." Silence was absolute. Richard crumpled the speech paper in his hand but didn't read it. He spoke from the heart. "I used my money, my contacts, my hatred to destroy the rest of his life. Took away jobs, homes, dignity, did what the system didn't. But I found out that revenge doesn't bring peace. It just brings more emptiness." Several journalists were scribbling furiously. Others just watched, mouths agape. Then Sarah came forward without warning, grabbed the microphone with her tiny hands and said, "Mr. Richard did really ugly things when his heart was sick, but after he became our friend, he started doing beautiful things. And I think that's what being good is. It's not never having done anything wrong, it's choosing to do right when you have the chance." Ooh, when the girl returned to Jennifer's arms, the entire hall seemed to breathe together, as if they had all been holding their breath until that moment. After the conference, the city seemed split into two worlds. On one side, people who understood the weight of Richard's confession and admired his courage. On the other, those who only saw another millionaire trying to clean his image. But at Mama Rosa's, none of that mattered. There, mornings still smelled of fresh coffee and hope, while children arrived excited for breakfast and the day's first activities. The next day, the cafe was packed like never before. Lines formed on the sidewalk, people curious to see the place so talked about on TV. Some came just to peek, take pictures of the sign, post on social media. But most came in respectfully, shyly asking for the menu, as if it were a sanctuary. Mama Rosa welcomed everyone with the same caring smile, making no distinction between journalist, neighbor, or tourist. Sarah darted from table to table, showing new visitors where to sit, introducing Tommy and other friends. "This one learned to make pancakes last week, and that one over there washes cups better than most adults," she said proudly. Richard, sitting near the register, watched it all with a heart overflowing. Every time Sarah gave him that shining look, he felt saved all over again. But along with the bigger crowds came tensions too. A sensationalist reporter showed up and started asking invasive questions. How does it feel? knowing that the man who bankrolled all this is a self-confessed vengeful person? Don't you think it's dangerous for a child to be so close to him? She fired at Jennifer. The young mother took a deep breath, held Sarah's hand and replied, "I'd rather have someone who had the courage to admit his mistakes and fix them than someone who pretends they never did anything wrong." Richard watched from afar, admiring Jennifer's strength. Rosa, meanwhile, came closer and whispered, "Life taught me never to trust rich men. But you're making me rethink that. Thank you for not giving up, even when it would have been easier to just disappear." He simply squeezed her hand, unable to speak without his voice breaking. That very afternoon, Frank showed up carrying boxes of donated toys and school supplies. "Thought this might help with the projects," he said, a bit awkward. Tommy and some of the other kids helped unload everything, and soon the cafe had turned into a little battlefield of paper airplanes and laughter. Richard watched it all, thinking how absurd it was. He and Frank, the destroyer and the avenger, now together building something for children they themselves had never been. When the day ended and the cafe closed its doors, Rosa proposed something unexpected. "Let's make a mural right here by the entrance, with photos of the kids, the families, everyone who comes through here, so no one ever forgets what we built together." Sarah jumped with joy, promising to draw hearts and stars for decoration. Frank nodded, discreetly wiping the corner of his eyes. "Yeah, no one's going to forget." Later that evening, Richard stayed alone in the cafe, most of the lights off, breathing in the gentle scent of vanilla and cinnamon that filled the place. He closed his eyes and could almost hear Emma and the kids' laughter, as if they were sitting at the tables around him. "We did it, my love," he whispered into the emptiness. And for the first time in years, he felt he wasn't speaking to himself. Mama Rosa's daily routine became something almost sacred to Richard. Every day he arrived around 8, ordered the coffee Sarah prepared with a moving seriousness, and sat watching the place come alive. The old doorbell never stopped ringing. Children walked in laughing. Exhausted but hopeful mothers shared confidences while straightening their kids' uniforms. It seemed that cafe was the neighborhood's lungs, breathing and spreading oxygen made of affection. Sarah had become a little queen of the place. She knew who liked pancakes with honey, who preferred them with jam, who needed a hug before starting the day. Tommy, who used to be sullen and full of anger, now helped her organize the cutlery. Sometimes he even made up stories to entertain the younger ones. Frank worked quietly at the counter, but would now and then crack a joke that made even Rosa burst out laughing. One afternoon, Richard arrived and found Sarah writing in a notebook full of colorful stickers. "It's my cafe memory book," she said proudly. She showed him pages with names, little phrases, even drawings of hearts. "Here," I wrote, "Mr. Richard has the saddest and most beautiful heart I know." He nearly broke down right there. All he could do was hug the notebook to his chest and kiss the top of her head. Over time, letters started arriving from outside Cleveland. People sent donations, toys, handwritten notes. A lady from Tennessee sent a quilt she had made herself, saying she wanted to warm the cafe as if it were her own home. Mama Rosa cried when she opened the package. "It's so strange to feel we matter to someone who's never even seen us." One night, when the cafe was empty, Rosa called Richard over to sit. They stayed silent, looking at the streetlights through the shop window. "You know, Richard, I thought my life was over when I lost my husband. Then this little girl showed up at my door hungry, and then you came along full of pain, and without meaning to, you both gave me a new purpose. It's weird how God stitches everything together, isn't it?" Richard smiled, eyes moist. "Stitches it with threads we'd never understand on our own." So then Sarah appeared carrying 3 mugs of hot milk, carefully balanced on a tray. "So we can celebrate that tomorrow there'll be more coffee, more laughter, and more ways to be happy." The 3 of them toasted silently, each one quietly thankful in their own heart for being together despite all the pain that had brought them there. The Emma Wellington Foundation's project started to grow at a pace that even surprised Richard. Other neighborhood cafes wanted to replicate the model. Schools began referring at-risk kids to the cafe before and after school. Volunteer psychologists offered to give short talks. It was as if kindness had decided to bloom there and spread its seeds all over the city. One day, Richard received a visit at the cafe from a young businessman, owner of a restaurant chain, who wanted to invest in the foundation. "I saw you on TV. Thought it was just emotional marketing. But then I came here and, well, this is different. There's something real here." Richard shook his hand, surprised by the honesty. Sarah soon came over with a tray of cookies and offered him one. The man bit into it, smiled and said, "This girl's got a future as a chef." Richard looked at her proudly. She's got a future of changing the world. But not everything was applause. A local councilman who had always campaigned against dangerous handouts started criticizing the project. He said in interviews that exposing children to commercial environments under the guise of education was unethical. Richard, Mama Rosa, and Jennifer discussed at length what to do. It was Sarah who resolved the dilemma in the simplest way. "We'll just keep being kind, helping whoever needs it. Whoever doesn't like that, it's because they don't understand anything about love." On a rainy morning, Rosa came in with her apron all wet and confessed she had prayed all night for answers. "You know what I dreamed? I was cutting a huge pie, and each slice fed a different family. But when I looked again, the pie was whole again." Richard chuckled softly. "I think that's God saying generosity doesn't run out." Frank had a relapse one night. They found him sitting outside the cafe, bottle in hand, muttering that he was a burden on everyone. Richard came over, sat beside him on the damp sidewalk and said, "You think you don't deserve any of this. But no one here is getting what they deserve. We're all here because we need each other to keep breathing." When Sarah came and saw Frank crying, she just hugged his neck and said, "You're not going to ruin it all, are you? Because I still need help putting together the gift boxes tomorrow." Frank let out a choked laugh and promised he wouldn't leave. The next morning, there he was, eyes puffy but steady, helping fold colorful papers with the kids. The end of the year brought a lightness Richard hadn't felt in a long time. Mama Rosa's was decorated with twinkling lights, simple wreaths made by the kids, and Christmas cards from all over. Sarah and Tommy organized a small Christmas play with makeshift costumes that made everyone burst out laughing. Frank was cast as the King of Presents, wearing a shiny paper crown, visibly embarrassed, but secretly happy. Jennifer showed up at the cafe one night wearing her hospital lab coat and shiny ID badge. "Came straight from my shift. I couldn't miss the rehearsal." Sarah ran to hug her. Rosa brought steaming mugs and, for a few minutes, the little cafe turned into a home full of stories where no one remembered overdue bills or old pains. One afternoon, Sarah asked Richard to help with something special. "I want to write letters to the people who sent us gifts, thanking them. Because I know there are kids far away who feel the same butterflies I used to feel before I had this place." Richard held her hand, moved. "You have a heart bigger than this entire cafe, you know that?" Sarah laughed. "Good thing, because that way it fits everyone I love." Rosa, listening from a distance, whispered to Jennifer, "I think God sent this girl to save all of us. Even Richard, who didn't seem to know how to be loved." Jennifer smiled. "Yeah. And now he's the one who tries the hardest to make sure no one ever feels alone." On an especially cold night, the cafe stayed open late, just so the homeless could have some hot soup. Frank organized lines, Rosa gave out hugs, and Sarah went from table to table asking names and stories. When they closed up, Rosa said, "This was the most beautiful Christmas of my life, and I've lived many." With the new year, the Emma Wellington Foundation took off in ways no one could have predicted. The little cafe became a symbol of something bigger. Families supporting each other, children discovering talents, adults finding second chances. Richard went there every day without fail. Sometimes he arrived before Rosa opened just to breathe in the smell of the place, as if that aroma was the air keeping him alive. One Saturday morning, Richard arrived to find Sarah, Tommy, and two other friends painting signs for a community garden behind the cafe. They were all covered in paint. "Is that looking good?" Richard asked, smiling proudly. Sarah put her hands on her hips and struck an artist's pose. "It's more than good. It's a garden where we're going to grow things that take time, like courage and patience." Inside the cafe, Rosa was teaching a group of mothers to make simple cakes to sell and boost their income. Frank was helping pack delivery boxes, laughing and trading bad jokes that made Rosa pretend to be outraged. Jennifer, on her rare breaks from the hospital, gave mini talks on first aid. Richard watched it all from afar, feeling it was the greatest venture of his life. It didn't make money, but multiplied what money could never buy. The following week, they received a visit from a journalist who, unlike the opportunists before, seemed genuinely interested. He spent an entire day there, observing, interviewing mothers, eating pie. He left saying he had seen something sacred, even though no one used that word. When the article came out on Sunday, it spoke of a place where wounds aren't hidden, but treated together, as if loving was the greatest business in the world. Rosa cut it out and pinned it on the mural. One afternoon, Frank pulled Richard aside. "You know, I thought I'd never find a place where I felt welcome again. But here, even I can be useful. That's priceless." Richard placed a hand on his shoulder. "I thought my life was over too, but we're stubborn, Frank. We keep living, and if we're lucky, we keep fixing what we messed up." Sarah had caught the end of the conversation and jumped in the way only she could. "I don't think you two are fixing anything. I think you're planting new things, better than trying to mend what broke." Richard picked her up and hugged her tight. "Where do you come up with this stuff, kid?" "From love, duh. That's where the best ideas come from." 6 months later, Mama Rosa's was unrecognizable. Still simple, with formica tables and creaky chairs, but it exuded life. The mural now held photos of dozens of smiling children, thank you notes, clumsy drawings brimming with feeling. The garden out back bloomed with tomatoes, herbs and flowers, lovingly tended by small hands that had learned there the value of caring for something fragile. They picked a Saturday to be Foundation Pride Day. They organized a party where each child would show something they'd learned. Tommy recited a poem about friendship, another girl showed dolls she'd sewn, and Sarah led a small choir that had Rosa crying nearly the whole time. Jennifer handed out little first aid kits saying, "So you can take care of others like you take care of this place." After the performances, Richard tried to give a brief speech. But his voice faltered almost immediately. I can't explain what all of you mean to me. I just know that if my Emma and my kids could see this, they'd be so proud." Sarah ran up and grabbed his hand at the microphone. "They can see it, Mr. Richard. I feel like they can." That night, after everyone had left, Rosa found him sitting alone, staring at the hanging lights. "Are you happy?" she asked, drying her hands on her apron. "I am, very. But I'm also scared of losing all this, of failing them." Rosa gave his shoulder a gentle pat. "We're always going to be afraid of what matters. It's the price of loving." Sarah then appeared, half asleep, clutching a pillow. "Can I sit on your lap for a bit before Mum takes me home?" Richard settled her in and just savored her light weight, the scent of kids' shampoo. "I wouldn't trade this moment for any empire in the world, little one. Not one." And he stayed there until she fell asleep peacefully, dreaming, he hoped, of more happy days like this one. The year came to a close again. At Mama Rosa's, they decorated everything with ornaments made by the children themselves. The mural had practically turned into a family album. Photos of birthdays, school graduations, little notes scrawled in childish handwriting saying, "Thank you for giving me a home when I didn't have one." Watching it all, Richard felt like he was finally part of something bigger than the pain he carried. On a cold afternoon, Sarah sat in his wheelchair without asking. She wrapped her thin arms around Richard's neck and said, "Did you know you're my hero? Not because you gave me presents or made the cafe famous, but because you stayed. You didn't run when it was easier." Richard bit his lip to keep from crying. "I stayed because I had nowhere else to go, and then I found out this is where I wanted to be all along." Jennifer showed up soon after, carrying mugs of hot chocolate. Rosa came out of the kitchen drying her hands. Frank sat nearby. Tommy stood proudly with an apron stained with paint. There, in the modest warmth of the cafe, they formed a quiet circle, sipping their drinks while outside the cold wind howled. Each of them, in some way, had been saved by this place. Then, Sarah broke the silence with her disarming wisdom. I think you came here that day because God wanted there to be people to hold your hand, just like you hold mine now. Richard squeezed her little hand. You're the one who held me first, little one. And there, surrounded by the family he had chosen, Richard finally understood what Emma had tried to teach him all those years, that loving was always a risk, but it was the only risk worth taking, and that life, despite all its tragedy, could still bloom in the most unlikely places, like in a small cafe in the most forgotten part of the city, where a rich, empty man discovered, late but not too late, how good it was to have somewhere to come home to.